Battle of Fort Sumter. The Battle of Fort Sumter was the first time that disagreements between the northern states and the southern states turned into violence. It marked the beginning of the American Civil War. On April 12, 1861, General P.G.T. Beauregard led Confederate forces toward Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was controlled by the Union Army. After only one day of fighting, Union Major Robert Anderson surrendered. The Battle of Fort Sumter was a major Confederate win. It marked the beginning of their success in the South. Just after news broke that Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, the state succession crisis broke out. South Carolina was the first state to succeed. South Carolina left the Union in December of 1860. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Arkansas later broke away from the Union too. These states formed their own country. They called themselves the Confederate States of America. There were many reasons why these states chose to leave the United States. They had very different ideas about slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion. Fort Sumter was a U.S. military fort near Charleston. The fort was built to protect Americans from attacks made from the Atlantic Ocean. Before South Carolina left the Union, there was only one army in America, the United States Army. After the Confederacy was formed, they decided to form their own army. After the Confederate Army was formed, Union Major Robert Anderson and 85 soldiers moved to Fort Sumter. The Confederacy was not happy that Union troops were at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was in Southern Territory. Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard and his Confederate troops surrounded Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Beauregard told Major Anderson to surrender the South Carolina fort. Anderson refused. Early the next morning, the fighting began. For 32 hours, the over 500 Confederate men fired on Fort Sumter. Union soldiers could not return fire for the first 2 hours of the battle because they were low on supplies. When the Union troops finally began firing, they were only able to use solid shots. They did not have any fuses for their exploding shells. The battle continued into the night. Union forces were only able to make slow, scattered attacks because of their low supply of ammunition. On Saturday, April 13, 1861, Major Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter to the Confederates. Anderson was given 1 day to evacuate his troops. He was also allowed to perform a 100-gun salute. Unfortunately, there was an accidental explosion while the army was settling up for the salute. There were only 2 deaths during the Battle of Fort Sumter. One of the deaths happened during the accidental explosion. The other death occurred during the actual fighting. On April 14th, the Union soldiers that were stationed at Fort Sumter boarded a ship to leave. These troops were greeted like heroes when they returned to the North, even though the Confederates had won the battle. The win boosted Confederates' confidence. It proved their strength to the North. Fun fact: the first death of the Civil War did not actually happen until the day after the Battle of Fort Sumter began. Union Private Daniel Hugh died while loading a cannon. Before General P.G.T. Beauregard left his Confederate troops at the Battle of Fort Sumter, he was one of Major Robert Anderson's students at West Point, the United States Military Academy.